Are those rumors true?
No, they are lies.
The whispers began before the wedding bells ever rang. Even before Lady Rosalie Everleigh stepped through the doors of St. Matthew's Chapel. Half of London had already decided what kind of woman she was, a ruined one. No one said it loudly, of course. Cruelty among the aristocracy rarely arrived with raised voices. It hid behind silk fans, lowered lashes, and phrases dressed as pity. I heard she disappeared with a gentleman when she was 17. They say she spent 3 nights away from home. Poor Duke Sebastian. He deserves a bride without scandal attached to her name. The pity was worse than contempt because pity allowed people to feel kind while doing something unforgivable. At the altar, Duke Sebastian Ashcroft stood with the composure of a man who had been trained since childhood never to reveal discomfort in public. He was 34, handsome in the severe manner of old portraits, with dark blonde hair brushed neatly back and eyes the pale gray of winter mornings. London respected him because he was disciplined, wealthy, and careful. Mothers admired him. Fathers trusted him. Young women found him intimidating enough to mistake restraint for mystery. He had heard every rumor about Rosalie Everleigh. And though he would never have admitted it aloud, he had believed enough of them to let those rumors shape the space between them before she had even reached his side. When Rosalie appeared at the end of the aisle, the chapel seemed to hold its breath. She wore ivory satin trimmed with delicate lace, a gown chosen for dignity rather than display. Her copper-red hair shimmered faintly beneath the veil. And her face was calm in a way that unsettled Sebastian more than tears would have done. There was no visible shame. No trembling apology. No desperate attempt to appear innocent before a room determined not to believe her. Only quietness. Only endurance. Sebastian watched her approach and told himself that duty did not require affection. Years earlier, his father had promised the Everleigh family an alliance. That promise had survived illness, debt, gossip, and the slow collapse of Lord Everleigh's influence. By the time Sebastian inherited the title, the arrangement had become less a courtship than a debt of honor. Refusing Rosalie now would destroy what remained of her family's standing and make the Ashcroft name look. So he married her. Not because he loved her. Not because he trusted her. He married her because he had been raised to keep promises, even when those promises came wrapped in. The ceremony passed with merciless elegance. Sebastian noticed that her hand was cold when he placed the ring upon her finger, but she did not pull away. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, the chapel erupted into polite applause, the kind that sounded more like judgment than celebration. Sebastian kissed her gloved hand. Nothing more. If Rosalie was hurt by the restraint, she gave no sign of it. The wedding breakfast at Ashcroft Hall glittered with silver candlelight and expensive restraint. Tables overflowed with sugared fruit, roasted game, and white roses. And crystal glasses that caught the firelight beautifully. Musicians played from the far corner while guests performed the exhausting ritual of pretending not to discuss the very thing they had come to witness. Rosalie sat beside Sebastian as his duchess. People congratulated her, studied her, measured her. Every woman who approached seemed to offer 2 conversations at once. One spoken aloud, polished and harmless. The other hidden beneath the curve of a smile, asking the same question all London had been asking for years. Was it true? Rosalie accepted every greeting with graceful composure. When Lady Marrow leaned close and murmured that marriage was a merciful second beginning for women who had suffered unfortunate misunderstandings, Rosalie thanked her as if the insult had been a blessing. When an elderly baroness squeezed her hand and said she hoped the Duke's generosity would be rewarded, Rosalie smiled with such perfect restraint that Sebastian almost looked away. Almost. He could not decide whether her silence was pride or guilt. That uncertainty irritated him. A guilty woman might have begged for understanding. An innocent one might have defended herself. Rosalie did neither. She simply endured the room as if she had endured rooms like it for so long that pain had become a language she no longer needed translated. By midnight, the guests had begun to depart or drift toward their chambers. Ashcroft Hall softened into post-celebration quiet, with servants collecting abandoned glasses and extinguishing candles one by one. Somewhere below, laughter still echoed faintly from the last lingering guests. But the bridal chamber had already gone still. Rosalie stood beside the tall windows, removing her earrings with slow, careful movements. Sebastian remained near the fireplace. The room was warm. Too warm, perhaps. The flames threw gold across the walls and made the ivory silk of Rosalie's gown glow like something fragile held too close to light. For several moments, neither spoke. At last, Sebastian said, "I believe honesty may spare us unnecessary disappointment." Then she lowered the earring into its box and turned to face him. "I agree." Instead, it made the words feel harsher. Sebastian folded his hands behind his back. Not because he wished to appear cold but because he did not entirely trust himself to be kind. "I intend to treat you with courtesy. Your position in this house will be respected. And no one under my roof will be permitted to insult you." Rosalie listened as though he were outlining the rules of an estate lease. "You will have your own rooms, your own household authority, and whatever comfort my name can provide." The edge of the truth neither of them had spoken. "But I do not expect this marriage to become anything more than an arrangement." Rosalie looked down at the gloves folded neatly in her hands. "Because of what you've heard." Her mouth curved slightly, though there was no amusement in it. "How strange," she said. "People always seem embarrassed by their own certainty when asked to name it." "I did not say I believed everything. Only enough." For the first time that evening, the composure on her face shifted. It was not shame he saw there, nor anger in its simplest form. It was weariness. A deep, practiced weariness that seemed far older than a woman of 26 should have carried. She crossed the room to a small traveling trunk set near the foot of the bed and knelt before it. From beneath folded shawls and a packet of letters tied with faded ribbon, she removed a worn wooden box. Its corners rubbed smooth by years of handling. When she returned, Sebastian noticed that her fingers were not trembling. That too unsettled him. "This belonged to me before the rumors began," she said. She placed the box in his hands. Inside lay a blue ribbon, a pressed white flower, several letters that had never been sealed, and a small leather-bound journal softened by age. "If we are to spend our lives together," Rosalie said, "then perhaps you should know who you married." "Are you going to explain? You would rather I read a child's diary than hear the truth from your own mouth?" It changed very little. Rosalie moved toward the adjoining sitting room, pausing only when her hand touched the door. "If my own words are not enough, Your Grace, then nothing I say tonight will matter. But those pages were written before I learned how little people wanted the truth when gossip was more entertaining." Then she entered the sitting room and closed the door behind her. Sebastian remained alone in the bridal chamber, holding the history of a woman he had already judged. For a long while, he did not open the journal. He told himself it was because reading it would be intrusive. Because a gentleman did not examine a lady's private thoughts without permission. Because the hour was late, and the day had been long. And nothing written in a young girl's hand could change the nature of reality. But beneath each excuse sat a quieter truth. He was afraid it would change something. At last, he sat near the fire and opened the first page. The earlier entries were painfully ordinary. Lessons with a governess. A complaint about rainy weather. An enthusiastic description of a book she had clearly loved more than the person who assigned it. A childish irritation with her mother's insistence. That copper hair looked better beneath cream-colored ribbons than blue ones. Sebastian almost closed the journal then. This felt too intimate. Not scandalous. Intimate. The girl in those pages was not the silent woman London pitied and condemned. She was bright, observant, impatient, and occasionally funny in a way that made him pause despite himself. Then came the entries from Rosalie's 17th year. "Today, Father finally agreed to let me visit Aunt Margaret. I promised to return before dark. Though I wish everyone would stop speaking of the roads as if highwaymen hid behind every hedge." Several pages later, the handwriting changed. The letters became less even, less confident. "I am frightened. They say I should rest, but I do not know where I am, and every time I ask. The woman with the gray scarf tells me not to make matters worse." Sebastian went still. He turned the page. "I heard men arguing downstairs. One said ransom. Another said Everly will pay if he wants the girl back untouched by scandal. I do not understand why they keep using that word as if scandal is something that can happen to me without my consent. The fire shifted in the grate. Outside, snow tapped softly against the windows. Sebastian read on. I came home today. Mother cried when she saw me, but father would not meet my eyes. They asked me whether anyone had hurt me. I said no. But they still looked at me as though something invisible. The next entry had been written with heavier pressure. Father says no one must know I was taken. It will only care that I disappeared. Mother says it is better if people believe I ran away with someone foolishly. Because a foolish girl may still be forgiven more easily than a stolen one. Sebastian stopped reading. The room seemed to tilt slightly around him. He looked toward the closed sitting room door. Behind it, Rosalie remained silent. He returned to the journal. I did not run away. I did not belong to anyone. I was simply unlucky enough to become a story others preferred over the truth. The entries after that became fewer. Shorter. Sharper. Lady Harbury did not invite me this season. Mother pretended not to notice. A gentleman asked father about my adventure and laughed. Father left the room. I tried explaining to Miss Vane today. She listened kindly until I finished, then said that even if nothing happened, appearances matter. I think appearances are where compassion goes to die. Sebastian closed his eyes. A slow, unfamiliar shame moved through him. The shame of recognizing that one's cruelty had been polite, reasonable, and socially acceptable enough to feel. He had not mocked Rosalie. He had not repeated the ugliest whispers. He had not allowed anyone to insult her openly in his presence. And yet he had believed the world before he had asked the woman. He opened the journal again. The later pages had been written by a woman, not a girl. I have stopped correcting them. It is exhausting to defend yourself against people who believe doubt is generosity. Another entry. Sometimes I think the worst part was not being taken. It was coming home and discovering that the world expected me to prove I was still myself. Sebastian's hand tightened around the edge of the page. Then he reached the final entry. It had been dated 3 days before the wedding. I do not know whether Duke Sebastian Ashcroft believes the stories. I suspect he does, though perhaps he is too honorable to say it cruelly. That is something, I suppose. If one day I am loved, I hope he understands this. I have never belonged to another man. Not because I am perfect and not because fear left me untouched. But because my heart never stopped believing that someday someone would see me before they saw the. Sebastian lowered the journal slowly. For several moments, he could hear nothing except the fire and his own breathing. He had imagined that marrying Rosalie despite her scandal made him the one extending dignity. Now he understood the terrible arrogance of that thought. She had not needed his tolerance. She had needed belief. And he had entered their marriage offering everything except the one thing she had been denied for 9 years. He rose from the chair. The sitting room door stood only a few steps away, but it seemed suddenly impossible to approach. He wanted to knock, apologize, explain that he had been wrong. But every apology that formed in his mind felt too small for the years she had lost. At last, he crossed the room and lifted his hand. Before he could knock, Rosalie spoke from the other side. You may come in. She sat near the window, still in her wedding gown, though she had removed her veil. Moonlight softened the copper of her hair and made the shadows beneath her eyes more visible. She looked tired, not from one wedding day, but from a lifetime of being misread. The journal remained in his hand. Well. It sounded like someone bracing for an old wound to be struck in the same place. Sebastian stepped inside and closed the door behind him. For the first time since meeting her, he did not know how to arrange his face into composure. Who took you? The question unsettled her more than an apology would have. No one important. They knew my father would pay quietly if scandal could be threatened. He did. Punished. Your Grace, men are rarely punished for ruining a woman's life if they can persuade society. That she ruined it first. Sebastian felt the words like a blade sliding beneath the ribs. I believed them. I believed enough of them. I am ashamed. Then she said very softly, good. She said it because shame properly understood might be the first honest thing between them. Sebastian sat across from her, leaving space enough that she would not feel crowded. How did you survive it? At first, I thought if I behaved perfectly, people would grow bored. Then I thought if I became very quiet, they would forget. Eventually, she said, I learned that survival is not the same as being believed. He understood with the sickening clarity of a man arriving too late to a truth. That this wedding night had not revealed his wife's purity. It had revealed his own failure. Not because he had wanted proof, but because proof had existed only because people like him had demanded it from women like her. I cannot undo what I thought, he said. You believe that is yours to decide? No. It is ours if you are willing. And somehow that felt more hopeful than forgiveness would have. Outside, the snow continued falling over Ashcroft Hall, covering carriage tracks, garden paths, and the footprints of departing guests. Inside, a husband and wife sat across from each other on their wedding night, not touching, not reconciled. Not yet anything as simple as happy. And beside it lay the first fragile possibility that truth, once believed, might someday become a beginning. The morning after their wedding arrived beneath a sky the color of old silver. And Ashcroft Hall resumed its ordinary rhythm with a cruelty that only ordinary things possessed. Servants moved quietly through polished corridors, carrying breakfast trays balanced against gloved hands. Housemaids refreshed flowers left behind from the previous day's celebrations. While footmen tended the fireplaces as though nothing remarkable had happened beneath this roof. The world continued. It always did, even after a person's understanding of themselves had been quietly dismantled overnight. Sebastian had not slept. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Rosalie standing in the bridal chamber. Placing that worn wooden box into his hands without pleading, without anger, and without demanding justice. She had simply offered him the truth and left him alone with the kind of shame that could not be argued away. For years, he had considered himself an honorable man. He had never mocked her publicly. He had never repeated the ugliest versions of London's gossip. He had never permitted anyone beneath his roof to speak openly against her. Until now, he had believed those things counted as virtue. Instead, he was beginning to understand that silence, when truth required courage, could become its own form of cruelty. He entered the breakfast room to find Rosalie already seated near the eastern windows. Sunlight touched the copper strands of her hair as she unfolded correspondence with graceful precision. Though the tea beside her had long since gone cold. She looked up when he entered. Good morning. And somehow more painful than anger. You wish to visit your father today, Sebastian said, taking the seat opposite her. If the invitation still stands, I would like to accompany you. You don't have to. For much of the drive, Rosalie watched the countryside beyond the carriage windows while Sebastian occupied himself with observations he should have made months earlier. When the horses stumbled unexpectedly over uneven ground, her shoulders tightened before she consciously relaxed them. Whenever a servant interrupted, she thanked them twice. Whenever she requested something, she softened it into a question, would it be possible? If it isn't inconvenient. Only if it causes no trouble. They were small habits, easy to miss. Yet together they painted the portrait of a woman who had spent years learning how to make herself smaller for the comfort of others. Everley House bore the marks of time more openly than Ashcroft Hall. The gardens remained lovingly tended, but age had settled into the stone itself. Cracks lined the fountain basin, and winter ivy climbed walls that had once hosted London's grandest. Lord Everley appeared older still. Illness had hollowed his face, but the moment Rosalie crossed the drawing-room threshold, something warm and fiercely protective illuminated his expression. My darling girl. Rosalie returned the embrace just as tightly. Sebastian turned away, suddenly aware that grief rarely belonged to one person alone. It lived inside entire families, reshaping the people who loved one another until survival itself became an act of devotion. Later that afternoon, Lord Everley requested a private conversation. I failed her. You loved her. I convinced myself dignity would protect her because I lacked the courage to challenge the world around us. By the time I realized what it had cost her, Rosalie had already learned to endure humiliation so gracefully that people mistook it for strength. His eyes drifted toward the doorway where Rosalie had disappeared only moments earlier. Please don't mistake survival for healing, Your Grace. In the weeks that followed, he stopped attempting grand gestures and impossible promises. Instead, he paid attention. He discovered that Rosalie preferred reading near open windows regardless of the weather. And that she had an inexplicable fondness for botanical illustrations. Often lingering over sketches of wildflowers with an expression softer than any he had yet seen directed toward another person. He noticed how quickly she apologized when servants dropped trays or guests arrived late. As though responsibility naturally sought her out. When she thanked him for something as simple as passing the marmalade at breakfast, he quietly replied, "You don't need to earn kindness." Rosalie looked at him as though she wasn't entirely certain what to do with the statement. Then she changed. Ashcroft Hall hosted a modest musical evening several days later. Nothing extravagant. Only neighboring families, tea, and polite conversation arranged beneath candlelight. Rosalie stood near the pianoforte, speaking with two elderly ladies. When Lady Harbury approached with the smile of someone convinced her own manners excused her curiosity. "I've always admired your composure, Your Grace." "That's very kind." Recovering from youthful indiscretions, Rosalie lowered her gaze for a fraction of a second. 9 years. 9 years of remarks disguised as sympathy. 9 years of allowing others to preserve their comfort at the expense of her dignity. Before she could respond, Sebastian stepped forward. "I believe you've mistaken rumor for fact." "I merely meant no offense." Sebastian followed her into the library. The door closed behind them with a muted click. Moonlight stretched across shelves lined with leather-bound volumes while silence settled heavily between them. "You shouldn't have had to hear that," he said quietly. Rosalie laughed. The sound lacked all amusement. "You say that as though today was unusual." She turned toward him. And for the first time since their marriage began, the careful restraint she wore so elegantly began to fracture. "Do you know what happens after 9 years, Sebastian? You stop expecting kindness because disappointment becomes exhausting. You learn which rooms are safest and which guests require your silence. You rehearse conversations before attending dinner parties and choose seats nearest the exits because leaving gracefully becomes more important than being comfortable. You become grateful for scraps. When someone says something cruel, you tell yourself at least they smiled while doing it. You don't become the hero of this story simply because you've discovered you were wrong. I lost 9 years. I entered every ballroom already knowing who strangers believed me to be. And now you feel ashamed. What a luxury." But consequence had belonged almost entirely to Rosalie. "You deserved better," he said at last. Rosalie shook her head. "I deserved belief." The distance between them remained, but it no longer felt cold. Sebastian listened more carefully when Rosalie spoke and remembered details he once might have overlooked. Returning from London with books he thought she might enjoy and botanical sketches tucked beneath his arm simply because he knew they would make her smile. He knocked before entering her sitting room. He asked rather than assumed. And when Rosalie apologized for things that had never been her fault, he gently reminded her that existing did not require permission. Sometimes she softened. Sometimes she withdrew. He accepted both. Months later they attended the Duchess of Rothwell's spring ball. Music drifted beneath crystal chandeliers while laughter echoed through the crowded ballroom. Sebastian had stepped away briefly when he noticed Lady Beaumont approaching Rosalie. "I've always admired your resilience." "How thoughtful." "Some stains never truly disappear. If anyone requires an example, I invite you to begin with me. I believed gossip before truth. If Her Grace has shown remarkable resilience, it is because society offered her no alternative." Then, before the watching eyes of London society, Sebastian extended his hand toward Rosalie. Not as performance. Not as apology. As a choice. Rosalie looked at it for a very long time. Then she placed her hand in his. That evening, back at Ashcroft Hall, they stood together. In the quiet library while spring rain tapped gently against windows. "If I had never shown you the journal," Rosalie asked softly, "would you have believed me?" "I think I would have lived my entire life believing I was a good man without ever realizing how easily goodness becomes cruelty when it demands proof before compassion." He looked at her. "I cannot return the years they stole from you, and I cannot undo the man I was. But if you'll allow it, I would like to spend the rest of my life becoming the man you deserved from the beginning. You think that's enough? I don't think anything ever will be. Then, Rosalie asked quietly. Not forgiveness? Then let's begin there, she whispered. Not with love. Outside, spring rain continued falling across the gardens of Ashcroft Hall. Inside, there were no miracles powerful enough to erase old wounds, and no apology grand enough to restore lost years. There were only two people learning that while truth sometimes arrived too late to prevent suffering, it did not always arrive too late to change what came. For the first time in nearly a decade, Rosalie no longer felt she had to prove who she was in order to deserve kindness. And for the first time in his life, Sebastian understood that love was not choosing someone because the world declared them flawless. It was looking at them after discovering how deeply the world had failed them. And saying. Outside the library windows, spring rain continued to fall over the gardens of Ashcroft Hall, washing away the last stubborn traces of winter from the stone paths below. The scent of damp earth drifted faintly through the cracked window, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings neither of them had expected to receive. For a long while, she simply looked at him. At the man she had married. At the man who had chosen at last to confront the ugliness hidden beneath his own certainty. He was not the husband she had once imagined as a young girl scribbling hopeful dreams into the pages of her journal. Perhaps he never would be. But neither was he the stranger who had stood before the fireplace on their wedding night offering courtesy. He had changed. Not through grand declarations, not through guilt alone, but through the quieter, more difficult work of listening when the truth made him uncomfortable and remaining when shame tempted him to look away. Rosalie lowered her gaze to their joined hands. 9 years. 9 years of measuring every word before speaking. 9 years of entering ballrooms prepared to be misunderstood. 9 years of carrying evidence of her own humanity as if it were a burden only she was responsible for proving. Slowly, she tightened her fingers around his. Sebastian looked down at the small movement before lifting his eyes to hers. Is this forgiveness? He asked softly. A faint smile touched Rosalie's lips. No. Instead, relief washed across his expression. Because forgiveness given too easily would have diminished the cost of everything she had endured. Rosalie's voice remained gentle when she continued. This is simply me deciding that I no longer wish to live according to other people's versions of my story. And what role do I have in that story now? That depends. I suppose I shall have to spend the rest of my life proving myself. Then after a pause long enough to alter the course of both their lives, she added softly. But for the first time. Her gaze softened as it rested on him. I think I'd like to know the man beneath the title as well. Inside Ashcroft Hall, no miracle erased the years they had lost. No apology restored what had been taken. There remained difficult conversations still waiting to be had. And wounds that would ache from time to time when memory proved stronger than reason. But for the first time since Rosalie Everly had become a story whispered through London's drawing rooms, she no longer stood alone against the weight of other people's assumptions. And perhaps that was where love truly began. Not in certainty. Not in perfection. But in the quiet courage of saying, I know what the world believes about you. I know how easy it would be to look away, and still, I choose to stay.